New York City is not just fighting high rent, it's fighting math. State fiscal watchdogs warn the city's budget gaps could reach about $10 billion in fiscal year 2027 and climb to about $13.6 billion by fiscal year 2029, driven by slowing growth, rising costs, and federal funding uncertainty. In a city this expensive, that isn't a far-off spreadsheet problem. It's a countdown clock. And the next mayor's choices won't just shape affordability, they could decide whether the city stays financially stable at all. That's why Zohran Mamdani's rise scares some people and electrifies others. He's selling a simple idea. New York is too expensive, and the government has to step in harder. His platform calls to freeze rents for rent-stabilized tenants, build more affordable housing, and crack down on bad landlords, wrapped inside a broader affordability agenda meant to make daily life easier for working families. Supporters see emergency relief. Critics see a socialist-style experiment in the most important city economy in America. The real issue isn't whether the goals sound compassionate. The issue is whether they survive contact with New York's financial reality. Here's the first reality check that often gets buried under slogans. A mayor can't just wave a wand and rewrite the entire economic system. City Hall can propose a budget, steer agencies, appoint leadership, and fight for policies. But major tax changes often run through Albany, and some cost drivers like federal funding shifts are not controlled by any mayor. So when a campaign promises sweeping change, the first pressure test isn't ideological. It's mechanical. What can the mayor do on day one, and what requires years of negotiation and political trade-offs? Now bring that question to the headline promise, freezing the rent. For a renter living paycheck to paycheck, a rent freeze sounds like oxygen. It's the difference between staying in your neighborhood or being pushed out, between keeping your kid in the same school or starting over across the city. In a place where one rent increase can knock a family off balance, the moral appeal is obvious. But here's the line that separates campaigning from governing. A rent freeze doesn't freeze the costs of running a building. Insurance rises, labor costs rise, materials rise, boilers break, roofs leak, property taxes still come due. And in New York, many landlords aren't mega corporations with endless cash. Some are small owners with one building or retirees using rental income to pay their own bills. If policy protects tenants but squeezes building finances until maintenance collapses, the city doesn't get justice. It gets worse. That's the risk critics are pointing to, and it's not theoretical, it's the basic physics of costs. And this is where the debate turns ugly fast, because both sides are talking about real people. Tenants want stability. Small landlords want survival. The city wants safe, livable housing stock that doesn't rot from neglect. If Mamdani pushes a rent freeze, he has to answer the question that decides whether it's relief or ruin. What happens when operating costs rise but rents don't? Do we see more deferred repairs, more abandoned units, more distressed loans, and more pressure on neighborhoods already short on quality housing? Now add the second flashpoint, taxes. Mamdani's approach depends heavily on the idea that the city can raise more revenue from those at the top to fund relief for everyone else. The political logic is simple. New York has extreme inequality, and the richest New Yorkers and biggest firms can afford more. The economic risk is also simple. If high earners or major employers change behavior, move income, move headquarters, cut hiring, the revenue you're counting on can shrink faster than politicians expect. This is where New York's fiscal timing matters. The state comptroller's office doesn't just warn about big gaps. It warns the city could be dangerously exposed if even a mild recession hits, because tax revenues alone are unlikely to close future gaps. That changes the stakes of every new promise. You don't just ask, is this a good idea in a strong economy? You ask, does this still work when Wall Street has a bad year, layoffs rise, and tax collections soften? That is the moment when budgets snap. And New York doesn't have the luxury of pretending a downturn can't happen. The city's finances already include huge outside funding streams that can shift with politics. DiNapoli's office points out that total projected revenues include more than $28 billion in state and federal categorical grants, largely for education and social services. Those dollars aren't guaranteed forever, and the report flags uncertainty from Washington. That's not background noise. If federal rules change or funding gets squeezed, City Hall is forced to cover gaps or cut services, and either choice triggers blowback. Now, here's where the Mamdani story collides with a number most candidates would rather avoid. New York has been spending billions on emergency shelter and services for people seeking asylum. The NYC Comptroller reports the city spent about $1.41 billion in fiscal year 2023, about $3.75 billion in fiscal year 2024, and about $3.02 billion in fiscal year 2025. $3 billion in a single year is not a rounding error. It's the kind of money that forces trade-offs in every neighborhood, even when nobody wants to say it out loud. This is why dropping those numbers without a policy connection is dangerous. So let's connect it directly. Whether Mamdani likes it or not, he inherits this fiscal reality. If he wins, he doesn't start with a clean slate and a blank check. He starts with existing obligations and emergency costs that already compete with schools, sanitation, policing, and housing enforcement. The comptroller's analysis also notes an OMB cited per diem around $371 during fiscal year 2025 for providing shelter and services. When you're paying a high daily cost at scale, the totals snowball quickly. So the pressure test question becomes unavoidable. Does Mamdani plan to reduce these emergency costs through policy changes, tighter management, different shelter strategy, or outside funding? Does he plan to hold spending flat and shift resources into long-term housing solutions? Or does he plan to expand new programs while this spending continues in the background? If he doesn't answer that clearly, then the city is effectively asked to gamble with two stacks of commitments at the same time. Now we move from operating budgets to the other bill New York has to pay, its debt. New York borrows to build the infrastructure that makes the city function: schools, water systems, roads, affordable housing projects, and more. The NYC Comptroller's annual debt report shows debt service as a share of city tax revenues was about 10.2% in fiscal year 2025, below the city's 15% affordability ceiling. That sounds comfortable until you remember what happens when interest rates rise and capital needs keep growing. The report projects debt service could move closer to that ceiling over time under conservative assumptions. In plain English, borrowing remains possible, but it gets harder and more expensive, and it eventually crowds out other priorities. This is where the what breaks first scenario becomes real. If revenue underperforms and spending commitments expand anyway, New York has only a few levers. It can raise taxes again, it can cut services, or it can borrow more and pay more interest. None of those options are painless, and the people who feel it first are not politicians. It's the family calling 311 who waits longer for help. It's the tenant whose building repair gets delayed. It's the small business owner who sees foot traffic drop and costs rise. This is why fiscal stability isn't a Wall Street obsession. It's a neighborhood issue. And Dina Puli's office adds another escalation that should scare everyone. The published budget gaps may be understated because the city assumes unlikely declines in costs for major areas like social services, education, MTA subsidies, and overtime. When a watchdog tells you the official numbers may already be too optimistic, that's not a warning to take lightly. That's a red flag that the window for nice-to-have spending is closing and the era of hard choices is arriving. So where does that leave Mamdani's agenda? If you listen to his supporters, they'll tell you the city is already failing working people, and bold action is the only moral response. They'll argue that if rent is crushing households, then freezing rents and expanding help isn't radical, it's basic protection. They'll say the real bankruptcy is a city that becomes a playground for the wealthy and a dead end for everyone else. If you listen to his critics, they'll tell you the city cannot afford ideological trial and error. They'll argue that the tax base is fragile, businesses have options, and even small shifts in high-income behavior can punch holes in revenue forecasts. They'll warn that if you squeeze housing finances while spending expands, you get a domino effect: building distress, reduced investment, weaker property values, and less revenue to pay for services. They'll say the city doesn't need a revolution, it needs stability and competence before it tries anything big. But the cleanest way to judge this isn't by choosing a team. It's by demanding operational answers. How does a rent freeze avoid creating a maintenance crisis when costs rise? What specific revenue sources pay for new programs, and what happens if collections come in lower than promised? How does the next mayor handle emergency asylum costs that already reached roughly $3 billion in 1 year while keeping core services intact? And how does City Hall prepare for a mild recession when state fiscal officials warn revenues alone likely won't close the gaps? Those are governing questions, not campaign questions. So here's the reality New York voters have to face. Mamdani's agenda could redefine what affordability looks like in a modern American city. And for millions of working families, that hope is not abstract, it's survival. But the city's finances are already under strain. The out-year gaps are measured in billions, and watchdogs warn the risks may be even larger than the official plan suggests. If this agenda works, it's a national model. If it fails, the bill won't be paid by ideology. It'll be paid by tenants, workers, and neighborhoods already stretched thin. New York doesn't have the margin for error to gamble blindly, and the consequences will land on the people with the least room to absorb them.